Hi, my name is Yuliya Fedorovych, and I'm an artist and designer from Ukraine. Recently, I created a series of posters that depict the history and consequences of the Holodomor. The Holodomor was a genocidal famine of Ukrainians orchestrated by the Soviet Union under Stalin that occurred between 1932 and 1933. The word Holodomor derives from the Ukrainian moriti holodom, which means to kill by starvation. The name of my project is Holodomor, with all the O's in the title crossed out, which symbolically depicts the death rate of Ukrainians during this genocidal famine. It's worth noting that we do not know and are unlikely to ever figure out the exact numbers of victims of the Holodomor, but we know for a fact that it's on the order of millions who died by starvation. Visually, this entire series of posters recontextualizes the typography and color scheme of Soviet propaganda posters of the time. This style has had significant influence on Western art and advertising and design, and it's often thoughtlessly positioned as hip and cool in popular culture. Therefore, it's beyond important to understand that behind the screen of these seemingly visually appealing designs, millions were killed, tortured, or driven to despair. This series of posters uses a similar visual style to inform the audience about the crime that propaganda posters were created to hide. The first poster is entitled Occupation, and it provides an overview of how the Holodomor started. We're going to explore this poster line by line like a book. So in the first line, private property is depicted as ears of wheat separated by fences, by these black fences. The two following lines show the Soviets coming to power and the beginning of the process of collectivization, through which farmers were forced to give up their private property and join state-owned collective farms. The last line shows the remains of crops that were carelessly harvested by Soviets, depicting the consequences of collectivization and the beginning of the famine. The next poster is called Enslavement, and it shows how the Soviets forced farmers to join collective farms. The majority of Ukrainian farmers refused to do so because they regarded collectivization as return to the serfdom of earlier centuries. To break down this resistance, Stalin introduced a policy of class warfare in the countryside. According to this policy, wealthy peasants and eventually just everyone else who resisted collectivization were labeled class enemies and were eliminated by Soviet soldiers and the secret police. All the land and property of so-called class enemies were confiscated, and their families were often evicted or deported. The third poster talks about deportation. During the long period of collectivization, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians were dragged from their homes, packed into freight trains, and imprisoned in remote, desolate areas such as Siberia. They were often left there without food or shelter, and many, especially children, died in transit or shortly after arrival. The fourth poster is called Robbery, and it's about the Torgsin stores. The name Torgsin comes from Russian Torgovля s inostrancami, which means trading with foreigners. These stores were initially created to serve tourists and visitors from abroad. However, the Soviet authorities soon realized that given the lack of food, people were ready to hand over their prized possessions for literally anything edible. The Torgsin stores, among other things, accepted gold, wedding rings, jewelry, old coins, and silverware. Gold was worth 5 times less than its market price. For instance, a gold wedding ring could be exchanged for just a few kilograms of flour or sugar. During the years of operations, the Torgsin seized 14 tons of pure gold from Ukrainians. The fifth poster is called Forbidden to Live, and it depicts a decree commonly known as the Law of 5 Years of Wheat. According to this decree, taking even the smallest amount of collective farm property was punishable by death, or in rare cases by at least 10 years of imprisonment. If someone was caught picking at least 5 years of wheat from the collective farm's fields, they were likely to be shot on the spot, even if they were children. The authorship of this decree is attributed directly to Stalin himself. And this law of 5 years of wheat obviously had no precedence at the time, nor it is today, because it effectively criminalizes the possession of food. And just to give you an example, in the Soviet legislation of the time, the premeditated murder was punishable by less than 10 years of imprisonment. And for the theft of any other property except the collective property, one would be sentenced only to 3 months of forced labor. The next poster shows how the Soviets condemned Ukrainian villages to death by starvation, by depriving them of food and limiting their freedom of movement. In early 1932, the Soviets introduced a system of internal passports, and these passports were not issued to villagers, and it was impossible to buy a train ticket without a passport. This was a way to prevent villagers from moving to cities in search of food. Most of them found themselves in a hopeless situation and were forced to eat tree bark, straw, leaves, roots, beetles, and burrs. Those who dared to travel to the cities often died on the road because of starvation and sickness. The seventh poster, entitled A Tragedy of a Grand Scale, depicts the high death rate of Ukrainians during the famine. At the peak of the Holodomor in June 1933, around 28,000 people died of starvation daily. The repetition of the word Holodomor in each line of this poster symbolizes the scale of the genocide because it occurred in the entire territory of Ukraine at the time. The letter O in the word Holodomor initially symbolizes the windows of houses in which light, a sign of life, shines. But later the light goes out, the house is empty, and the windows get boarded up. Finally, the homes in which life once flourished are destroyed. As a result, prosperous and flourishing Ukrainian villages with fertile land became mass graves for people tortured by famine. The eighth poster is called Devastation, and it depicts the lengths desperate people went to survive in this time of famine. Barely alive, starving people picked up the bodies of the dead from the streets and delivered them for burial in return for meager crumbs of bread. This period was a wild mixture of life and death, which is likely impossible to comprehend. The ninth poster, entitled Lost Future, depicts the terrible consequences of the Holodomor. Among the millions who died, a third were children under 10. As a result, numerous generations of Ukrainians were lost forever. These lost generations are depicted in this poster as misshapen red flowers that never got a chance to grow. Those who survived are visually represented here with the white flowers, also misshapen and broken, that despite their survival never really recovered from what they had to face. Moreover, those who survived passed the trauma of the Holodomor to future generations, and many Ukrainians live with this intergenerational trauma to this day. The last poster is entitled Unpunished Evil, and it depicts how the Soviet government hid the Holodomor from the world behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviets spread propaganda, destroyed records, and intimidated witnesses. All of their efforts aimed at concealing the Holodomor were so effective that for 50 years after this tragedy, nobody was even attempting to talk about it. Finally, in the mid-80s, due to the pressure from the Ukrainian diaspora in the United States, the US Congress started to investigate the famine in Ukraine. They were able to find around 450 Holodomor survivors living in the US at the time. Around 70% of them were so scared that they were unwilling to testify before Congress under any circumstances. And two-thirds of those who agreed to testify were only willing to do so anonymously. The Holodomor is perhaps the greatest tragedy in the history of Ukraine. It has caused irreparable trauma for our entire people. Soviets and subsequently Russians have always denied the fact of this genocide, and no one was ever punished for these crimes. It's most likely that this impunity became a key factor that enabled Russia to start a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Their actions, accompanied by mass murders and violence against Ukrainian civilians, unquestionably bear the hallmarks of genocide. We must keep telling the truth about the Holodomor, because only by condemning the genocidal crimes and atrocities of the past can we prevent them from occurring again in the present.